Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Gary Goodman, and we are going to have a great show this evening.
When you do leave the theater tonight, be careful of your neighbor when you're leaving. We've had some reports of people falling down and bumping into one another.
Are they still darlings out here tonight? That's something.
We'd like to thank you for your patience and waiting. The stage is set, and the band is all ready to begin.
Can I call Pink? Doesn't seem to like him very much. Well, official Pink.
Hello and welcome to our latest episode of the Finkel's Cave podcast. Today we want to talk about the Wall live shows, which took place between February 1980 and June 1981. And I'm very happy that Kyle and Phil are by my side on this show. We all know Kyle from episode 17, Roger Waters' The Solo Works, where he provided us with some extensive knowledge about Roger Waters' live shows and his solo albums. Hi Kyle.
Yes, thank you. It's good to be here for a second go-around.
And I'm also very happy to have my co-host Phil Salathé with us today. As you may know, Phil is not only a music teacher, author, composer and musician, but also a longtime specialist in Pink Floyd. Welcome Phil, it's great to have you.
Great to be here.
So, there's so many things to discuss about this strange time between 1978 and 1982. But Kyle, what are our main topics tonight?
So tonight we will be discussing mostly the live performances between February 1980 and June of 1981. We're talking about the first show in LA. We're talking about one of the dates in the middle of the run when they go to New York. We're talking about Dortmund as pretty much a whole. And we'll be ending with a little bit of discussion on the 1981 performances, as by then they played the Wall just about 30 times, and the band got really good at perfecting the art of performing what Gerald Scarfe once described as a Roman circus, and I think it is very apparent to call it a Roman circus, because the Wall is woefully more complicated than anything the Floyd had done prior to this, so it'll be interesting to get into that a little bit, the complexities of staging a show like the Wall. And before we begin, though, I would like to briefly mention a book that I think all of our listeners, if you have even some sympathy towards this era of the Wall, you should pick up. That's Comfortably Numb, A History of the Wall by Vernon Fitch and Richard Mahone. As of the recording and release of this podcast episode, the book is still readily available on www.pfapublishing.com, and it stands without any doubt in my mind the most informational book on the Wall ever written. Covers the complete scope from the development in 1978 to the shows in 1980 and 1981. It's genuinely phenomenal. And this isn't sponsored. We weren't asked to pitch this to you all, but I, as someone who, when I got into the Wall, I saw this book and I was like, well, I have to pick it up because it seems very thorough. And even reading it in preparation for this podcast, I was still learning more, even though I bought the book 5 years ago. So it's genuinely worth adding if you don't already have it.
Yeah, and let me add too, I can absolutely confirm that it's still being sold because I just got my copy. I think I was a little bit confused because that final cut book of Vernon's went out of print so quickly. I didn't realize that there were still copies very much available of this one. So I received it quite quickly after I ordered it. It's a beautiful production. I've only had a chance to, I've looked through it once and have now begun to read it in a more proper fashion. Also, I suppose I should mention that I believe that Richard Mahon is no longer with us. I think he passed away a short while ago. So that's a bit of sad news, but Vernon Fitch is, as far as I know, very much still with us. And it's really you won't regret picking it up. Let's put it that way. As you say, if you have any sympathy towards the Wall, any interest in it, it's certainly going to give you the chance to, pun intended, immerse yourself in it a bit more. So
yeah, great. So before we start talking about the tour, let's talk a little about the album, The Wall. Kyle, could you give us a little background information on the album?
Well, as has been written in the tomes of Floyd history, and people probably have known for upwards of 50 years, the beginning of The Wall, or not 50 years, excuse me, some 45 years or so, The Wall begins at in Montreal in 1977. Roger is so disenchanted with the live experience in a arena that he, at some point during the show, spits on a fan, recoils back, realizes, my God, what have I done? And starts developing this idea where there's a wall between the audience and the band, where the sort of idolatry of the audience cannot pierce through the heart of the music. And Roger would start working on the demos for two different albums, one of them being The Wall, the other being The Pros and Cons of Hitchhiking, and he presented both of them to the band in hopes that one of them would become a solo work. As history has shown, Pros and Cons ended up being Roger's first solo work, and The Wall ended up being the band project. And it's worthwhile to note, and I think a lot of people, when you discuss the demos of The Wall, they're very rough. It's Roger with a synthesizer and an acoustic guitar, and him almost whinging into this microphone for what has been described as about 90 minutes, but the skeletal structure of the entire album is there. It is astonishing how well put together The Wall was, even as this very early piece that the band would build up on. So it's not like Roger came in, well, I have a couple of ideas. No, the whole thing was laid out brick by brick, one could say. And from there, the band began work on various production demos to iron out The Wall. They had to go to France because of tax issues, and this was right in the middle of not only recording the album, but in the middle of Roger working with Gerald Scarfe on the sleeve and on the general artwork of the album. When Scarfe asked Roger, how are we going to keep working on this if you're in France? Roger just told him, well, you can fly out and show me the pieces and we'll discuss it there. Nothing would have stopped Roger from finishing this. And to some degree, the band had to, because they were in dire financial straits and they needed to finish the album, or they needed a album to put out because of the time that they were in.
So, Phil, from a musical point of view, how would you rate The Wall? I know that there are many Pink Floyd fans who stopped exactly 1979 because, in comparison to Animals, this Pink Floyd seemed not to be their Pink Floyd anymore. Do you see any connection to their former work at all?
Massive ones. So, I mean, first thing I want to say is I think based on, and Kyle and I had a laugh about this the other day when we chatted, I think I may have given the impression that I am one of those fans who bail out around 1977. I'm not actually. I love The Wall. I think for me, the Pink Floyd that means the most to me goes up to the release of the final cut. And then it's after that I begin, although I've been listening to Momentary Lapse of Reason lately and enjoying it. So who knows what can happen. Something that I never thought would happen in the 80s. But yeah, I mean, it's massively, massively connected to their prior work. At the same time, of course, I completely understand why someone would bail out, because they're trying to do something. Not only are they using different means of achieving their goals, it's no longer really about these four people, on stage. I was thinking actually in the hour or two before we met, just sort of mentally tracking through the number of people on stage at any given Pink Floyd concert and how it sort of went from 4, very briefly 5, then 4, then at Amouji back to 5 with Frank Zappa, then generally 4, right? And then for a while, it was a ridiculous number whenever they were performing Adam Heart Mother. But basically speaking, yeah, and then after that, it crept up and up through the years with more and more people, basically speaking. And then by the time you get to these shows, a lot of the people on stage are not band members, right? Which sounds like a silly point to make, but it's still, when you invest in a band, you invest in their story and the particularities of their personalities. And that was obviously getting washed out pretty significantly by the dominance of Roger Waters' particular musical vision out of necessity. I mean, everybody who talks about Roger, even if they hate him, always says he works his behind off, and he's very, very ambitious, very committed, and he goes for what he envisions. And so, but as a consequence, I think you can hear relatively little Nick Mason and relatively little Richard Wright. Not zero. There are some portions of The Wall where you really can hear that it's Richard Wright playing the keyboards. But by and large, those half the band is essentially sidelined or relegated to a role where their main job is to execute things that have already been imagined rather than to come up with their own new creative contributions.
You talk about the band members being sidelined, and what happens when the album first comes out on LP. You open up the gatefold and nobody but Roger Waters and David Gilmour are credited. Nick Mason and Rick Wright don't even have credits at all in the initial releases, and that was rectified with later pressings. But as you said, there's so many bit players. You have like Jeff Porcaro, who's on Mother, I believe, and then you have a different guitarist. The name escapes me right now. On Is There Anybody
Lee
Out
Ritenour.
There?
Lee Ritenour.
Lee Ritenour. He's on
I don't know
Is There
how I knew
Anybody
that,
Out
but I knew
There?
that.
Yeah, there you go. So he's on Is There Anybody Out There? Bob Ezrin comes in, and Ezrin's contributions to The Wall can't be understated. I mean, we wouldn't get the orchestra Uncomfortably Numb if not for Bob Ezrin. And The Trial wouldn't be the masterpiece that it is if not for Bob Ezrin either.
And there are other ways in which it deviates from the Pink Floyd template too. And I was sort of thinking about, Nils, when you posed that question to me, as we've heard for this episode about connections to Pink Floyd's past, one thing is it just has lots of connections to the past, period. And in other words, outside of Pink Floyd, because, I mean, look, we're talking about Roger Waters, a guy who later on turned around and wrote an opera. I mean, he made it pretty clear what his ambitions were, right? To borrow a phrase from German, the Gesamtkunstwerk, right? From Richard Wagner, taking all the art forms and unifying them under one bannerhead to make an experience which, in theory, is supposed to be the sum of its parts. And, like Richard Wagner, who, to put it politely, could be, in some aspects, maybe many aspects of his character, a bit of a jerk. We're dealing with Roger Waters, who is not the favorite person of every person on the planet at the moment. Neither those who know him nor those who don't. And yet both of them have this sort of visionary, quality of genius too, where they were able to imagine something that seemed absurd, and yet they made it happen, and not only made it very successful. So when we think about the ways in which The Wall is connected to the past in general, Richard Wagner is definitely strongly present, and the idea of leitmotifs, in other words, musical gestures that run through an entire piece to create a feeling that different passages of music are strongly associated and even symbolize different aspects of the emotional language of the piece or the dramatic language of the piece. So think about the number of times we hear the motive, the "we don't need no education" motive from Another Brick in the Wall Part 2 over and over again throughout The Wall, right? That's no accident. And there are other things, certain gestures of rising scales or things like that, where the connections are not as obvious, but it's still clear that we're talking about some kind of unified thing. I think more generally, it's connected to operas in general. And the most obvious example of that is actually in live performances when we hear The Last Few Bricks, right? That's a section of music which, and this happens to some degree within The Flesh too up front. But the idea is that in those two places, the Wall, in one place, it kind of introduces us to all the musical ideas to come. In another place, it kind of recaps them. That's what happens in The Last Few Bricks. But in general, operas always start out with something to give you some of the tunes that you'll be hearing later on, right? They want you to feel like when you hear that big melody coming from, whether it's a soprano wearing a horned helmet or a very tall, thin Englishman wearing a t-shirt with hammers on it, they want you to feel like that melody was inevitable, like that was going to happen no matter what. And one of the ways to do that is to plant it in your brain before you actually hear it ultimately. So it's using those devices all over the place. There's also, just sticking with classical music for a moment, there's also the connection to things like the device of the Baroque lament bass. Some listeners may know Henry Purcell's music and Dido and Aeneas, When I Am Laid in Earth, which is a very famous and very sad piece of music. And Comfortably Numb is basically doing the Baroque lament bass. In the verses, that bass line descending over and over again, that is a Baroque music thing. And it's certainly far from the only piece of music to do that in the 20th century. Tunes like 16 Tons, Tennessee Ernie Ford, that kind of thing, all do that too. But it's a kind of musical meme or something that we say in the classical music world is kind of a schema, right? It's a thing that people use over and over again. And so then within rock music, more specifically, when we think about the idea of a rock opera or a rock musical or whatever you want to call it, you're looking back at things like side B of Abbey Road, but also things like Tommy. Kyle, I think you and I were talking about the Pretty Things a little bit the other day, right? So all these examples of people trying to come up with, large scale things. You could factor in Sgt. Pepper, but that's much less unified. Obviously there are things that come back, but generally speaking, it's not nearly as unified as things like Tommy and side 2 of Abbey Road. And then if we look back at Pink Floyd specifically, there are definitely some very, very, very clear connections in terms of just instrumental techniques. I mean, one example is that in something like Run Like Hell, or for that matter, Another Brick in the Wall, that technique of using a delay to build up a texture which is richer than the person is actually playing. In other words, the delay builds up hits between hits such that, I mean, I remember when I first heard Another Brick in the Wall Part 1, I had no idea how David Gilmour was playing that. I just thought he was very, very fast. What you do is you set a delay time so that it's happening essentially every 3 ticks, and then you play every 2 ticks. And because of the way the mathematics works out, you get these interlocking patterns. And that's something I can certainly point to one of these days as one of the first time the band did something like that, where you get that constant, incessant bass line that's partly a product of how the delay time is set. And another way that Another Brick in the Wall connects to past music is through Breathe, right? If you think about it, the chord progression of Another Brick in the Wall is actually very, very similar to the chord progression to Breathe, or if you prefer, Any Color You Like. It's basically the same chords minus 1 or 2 decorative chords. So that was a progression that they used all the time. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in light of February 7th, 1980, because there's some things that happens during that show that I think make the connection very explicit. And finally, another thing that comes to mind in terms of instrumental performance techniques is the way in which Run Like Hell specifically can be traced very directly back to tunes like Baby Blue Shuffle in D major and The Narrow Way, right? Where Gilmour is using a very specific set of techniques involving playing the 3 highest strings on the guitar in a way so that he's creating chord shapes, typically parallel major and sometimes minor chords, over a droning D string. And that's something he was doing all the way back in 1968 there with fingerpicking, and then, with The Narrow Way, and also The Narrow Way Part 1, and then also tunes like Unknown Song, and even Alan's Psychedelic Breakfast. It's all part of the same D major kind of oscillating thing over that pedal point. I think Run Like Hell is very much related to that. And then finally, just to talk about a couple sort of more elliptical connections. One of them, I think it's song number 2. I want to make sure I don't get that right, because as soon as I say that, I find myself imagining Blur going woohoo. But I think that was the name of the outtake on The Early Years, which has sort of the same chords as Hey You, right? So, and it seems like a minor point. It's just E minor and D, pun not intended, by the way. It's just E minor and D minor. But one of the things I've noticed about Pink Floyd is they are so utterly relentless about self-plagiarizing. Any idea they used at any point in their career and cast aside almost always seems to show back up somewhere else. To the point where they're even overdubbing, different takes of the same song onto each other. I think I remember having an exchange. I don't remember with whom it was. Oh yeah, that somebody should write or maybe me should write a book about Pink Floyd called Using Every Part of the Animal, because it's almost like one of those hunters who insists that every part of an animal has to have some use, which of course is very respectful. And then one last thing. This is a little kind of bit, or maybe 2 last things. One of these is sort of a spooky experience I had when I was about 13 years old, and I was just getting into the Wall. Which, by the way, I was telling Kyle, it was one of the first Pink Floyd albums I have, and I specifically remember the tactile properties of the cassette because my best friend at the time, still one of my very close friends, I lent it to him and he lost it. So, and to my 13-year-old credit, I twisted his arm, figuratively, mind you, until he bought me a new copy. So, but I remember at about that age, I had this very vivid dream where I was watching a performance of Comfortably Numb, and at the same time, Syd Barrett was singing Opal over it. And I remember waking up from that dream thinking that's a really cool idea. Decades later, I realized why. They have the same chords, right? They have essentially the same, the chorus of those two, of Comfortably Numb and Opal, have basically the same chord progression. Also think about connections like, On a Distant Shore versus the use of the word distant and Comfortably Numb, right? And on top of that, this is getting a little bit more closer in proximity, but another route for Comfortably Numb is the way that if you listen to Gilmour's original demo, you can actually hear 1 or 2 of the same hints of the same lyrics as we get in the finished product too. So I think we usually credit all the lyrics to Waters, but I don't think it's a coincidence that in Gilmour's demo, which is played in the Wider Horizons BBC documentary, you can actually hear him say something about, I can't recall exactly what it is, but it is "there is no," or something to that effect. So that formulation is actually present in the demo. Then one last thing, and this sort of gets more toward the structure of the Wall, is just, I think that maybe here the closest comparison is the Beatles' Abbey Road medley, that when I drew myself up a little chart just to track all the different keys that are used in the Wall, and it's amazing how much very fixed set of keys is used, and how they seem to track to some degree with the textual subject of the songs in question. Right. For instance, let's take a look at the list of songs in C major, right? Or that use C major as a tonal center at some point. The Thin Ice is one of them. Mother is another one. One of My Turns is another one. And Nobody Home is another one. And I think that might be the last one. Oh, and then Outside the Wall, right? Well, there's a thread there, right? There's a thread of sort of, it's none of those are songs that focus on the kind of grandeur of live performance for the most part, right? They're sort of more internal, home-oriented songs. So I think there's something deep going on involving key architecture that wouldn't be the first time that Pink Floyd have thought about that. They think about that in Dark Side of the Moon, and they think about it in Wish You Were Here. But it's definitely present here. Now, the wild card there, by the way, is that in the film version of The Wall, they completely change the key in Outside the Wall, and they do something, I can't even think if the Pink Floyd have ever put a song in this key before, E flat major. So out of nowhere, they completely shift the tonal color and the key relationships. But there's a master's thesis or a doctoral thesis waiting to be written there. I've got a small child at home. I don't think it's going to be me who does this one, but somebody out there, please, do your dissertation on it so that I can cite it.
And I was going to mention, Phil, you mentioned Outside the Wall in the movie. Well, it's interesting you mentioned that because right after Roger finishes singing Outside the Wall, there's an extra tiny little piece of music. What is that? It's a song that was known in the demos as It's Never Too Late. And it's the only time that song is performed alongside Outside the Wall, with the exception of September 20th, 1987, where Roger brought the backing singers for The Wall out during a Chaos show, and Roger, without prompting them, starts singing, "Oh, it ain't easy," and he starts singing those lyrics, and it's the only time where Outside the Wall, as envisioned in the demos, is performed by Roger Waters.
Wow.
And it's a very bizarre. Roger must have been thinking it'd be funny to spring this on the punters. They don't know what it is I'm singing, even if it's only 2 lines, But then there's also the connection that I made, that when we talked, you completely affirmed that Goodbye Cruel World and Outside the Wall share the exact same structure, except it's what is it, transposed?
Yeah. So it's 14151. Yep.
Yeah, and then you think, well, how does that connect to the story of The Wall? Well, here's our character, Pink, closing in himself during Goodbye Cruel World, and Outside the Wall, he is free. It's that sort of circular structure of the story that comes back again.
And more generally, it's a device that so many composers will use where, ending large sections of a piece with the same formal closure device it's a very old tactic to unify. And I mean, that's always the challenge with something like this, right? You're trying to figure out how do you make it feel like a unified statement as opposed to a bunch of little vignettes. A lot of the people who like The Wall in some respects, where they often struggle is side C or side 3. I don't remember how it's not numbered on the vinyl, but in other words, where we get into Vera and Bring the Boys Back Home. And I think that's the place for a lot of people where they feel like it loses steam and it begins to become a bunch of vignettes. And for what it's worth, I wouldn't say I agree, but I understand why they're having that reaction at that particular point in time. To me, I've been listening to this album since I was so young that I can't imagine it any other way. It's just, well, that's just how The Wall goes. It's, it was handed down from golden tablets on high. Well, obviously not, but I've been listening to it for such a long time that it's just, I can't imagine it going any other way.
Okay, before we start now talking about the infamous tour start in Los Angeles in February 1980, let's talk about the rehearsals and this is very exciting, Kyle, you got the original live performance manuscript, which has been around in the internet for many years, but there's so many interesting things in there. Could you tell us a little bit more about it?
So the Wall Performance Manuscript is a document that started to surface over the years through photocopies upon photocopies upon photocopies, and many have sold on eBay over time. And eventually, and one day I thought to myself, well, what is actually in this? Because even on a preliminary read, okay, there's a section called Backs to the Wall in here. That's the working title for What Shall We Do Now? Why is that in here? And how old is this piece actually? And then I took it upon myself to start manually rewriting the whole thing line by line, because the photocopied versions are 60 pages long, and it's kind of a slog to go through entirely blank pages with one line on them. So I tried consolidating as much as I can. And What I found was that Roger, as my guess is that the document was written sometime in 1978, maybe early 1979, because there's explicit mentions during Comfortably Numb of it being the Doctor's song, which it was only referred to as the Doctor's song in a couple of demos before it was finalized. There's all sorts of things that would appear in the live shows, but not in the same form as written. For example, there's a section called pre-show or preliminaries, where they talk about where it's written that there are oral tricks and jokes, locked roadboxes with taped laughter coming out of them, the teacher's voice shouting in lavatories, "You there, put that away and get back inside this minute," which I can't imagine pumping random sound effects through a PA throughout the whole concert hall. I mean, that's, as only Roger Waters could lovingly try to put together. There is more emphasis on Britchrow bric-a-brac, which was supposed to be the merchandise themed after the bricklayers and the bricks themselves in the show. And then there's talk about a pre-show with World War II tunes, which there isn't a lot of pre-show recordings related to The Wall, but the very few that we do have where you can capture small glimpses of music, sure enough, there's World War II era music in there. And the most glaring example of this is in the live album, where you could hear what sounds like part of We'll Meet Again by Vera Lynn, and it is, but it's specifically a version in a medley from Vera Lynn's Hits from the Blitz, which I remember when I first listened to that iteration of it, there's that swell of the orchestra, and I knew I had found the right one. There are so many versions of We'll Meet Again because it's one of the most famous songs ever written from that period, but that's a whole other thing. If anybody somewhere out there knows the exact list of songs that was written, please write to me. I know that I figured out a few of them, but I would love to figure out the whole set, because I think, like everything else in the show, very deliberate choices are made. The weirdest thing in the performance manuscript, I think, and there's a lot of things that are interesting to read, that the existence of Empty Spaces and What Shall We Do Now as two separate songs, and I'll get into that when we could start talking about the rehearsals a little bit, but in the intermission, there is a whole theatrical scene between the intermission and the start of Hey You, where it reads, "House lights are down, a drone in A minor starts, and as the audience settles down, we establish the auditorium as the hotel room through a quad sound picture. Old Pink is slumped in the living room of the suite. The TV is on. The groupie is in the bathroom. She brings him a glass of water, which he throws against the wall. Then she starts, 'That's it. You are a weird man. You're nothing but a big baby.' He doesn't reply. She says, 'Listen, if you don't tell me, I'm leaving.' And she exits, establishing the door of the hotel room, which is at the stage end of the auditorium. Nowhere in the studio album, the live show, or the movie does this scene exist. It doesn't exist in any of Roger's interpretations like Berlin or the 2010 to 12 Waltz tour. It's this weird vignette that exists nowhere else. And Phil, you theorize that it might have been something that a groupie said to Roger at some point in his life.
Or a spouse. I mean, it's one of my rules is that the weirder something is, the more likely it is to be real. Now, obviously, that's not an issue here, but I mean, I remember, and I don't want to judge two people too harshly. I remember the first time I heard the One of These Days demos, I thought to myself, oh, this is so crude. It can't be Pink Floyd. Well, it is. Similarly, I remember when the Under Construction demos came out, a lot of people were saying, oh, these can't be real. No, Roger Waters would never write, I'm a physician, like a magician who can help with your condition, or whatever the line is. It's so, it's so thuddingly clunky. But that's exactly what made me think, oh, that's got to be real, right? Because if I were trying to fake it, I would, and this was back in the days when AI could not dream of doing something like that. Now, God help us if a really good AI faker starts putting stuff out there. But yeah, when I read that, I think to myself, who would ever write that? In other words, who would ever pull that from nothing, out of their brain? No one would. So that to me just screams, that's something that happened to him. And the phrasing, because the phrasing is so strange, it just doesn't feel like something that he would write unless he were quoting verbatim. And similarly, my own headcanon, if you like, is that he put that in there. It was something that happened to him that really freaked him out, maybe with a spouse, maybe with a groupie. And then he realized it was just too on the nose, and it was too personal, and he pulled it out, because that's just that's just weird. It makes me, even reading it makes me feel a little bit uncomfortable. So
What was it, Gerald Scarfe, when Roger first showed him the entirety of the Wall demo, Roger said to him in simpler terms, "I feel like I just took my pants off and took a shit in front of you." And Scarfe, without much else to say, agreed with Roger about that,
right.
because it's very true. The Wall is this very visceral piece that is so imbued in Roger's life and psyche that, yeah, that is really what it feels like.
And he draws so directly from his own life too. Like, I mean, for instance, something I forgot to mention earlier, the whole thing about, if you don't eat your meat, how can you have any pudding? I mean, that goes all the way back to 1969, right? He was using that sound effect at the Royal Festival Hall show on a loop. I think Vernon Fitch makes it sound like he re-recorded it. I'm not 100% sure it's not the exact same sample. I'd have to go back and listen. I don't want to make any claims. And in this, as with many things, I should say, there are people who have gone over, including yourself, Kyle, of course, there are people who have gone over this material with an absolute fine-tooth comb. So there are too many of them to give credit to everybody, but I want to make it clear that sometimes I'm making observations that I myself, can't take credit for. I'm merely just passing on others' wisdom and trying to consolidate it. But in this particular case, reading through the Fitch and noticing that was cited, to me, that's another thing that feels like it's got to date back verbatim. And I think actually Roger might have said this on record in an interview somewhere. That's pinging a memory bank. But that's another one of these, grabbing from, in my opinion, it's likely to be another one of these grabbing from your life, plopping it basically verbatim into your work of art. And so, yeah, that seems to be his tendency. By the way, another thing I want to say, it's funny. When I was 14 or 15, I would have read all that stuff about, what was it, the bric-a-brac, what was the Britco, Britco Brick Company and the Britco Bric-a-brac. And I would have assumed that everything about that was knowing irony. But after that interview with Jerry Shirley, that I did a couple episodes ago, one thing is he was very clear. They were very, very savvy merchandisers, right? They knew exactly, they were quite clear that they knew that would make them money. And, they can distance themselves all they want from what that seems to mean, either symbolically or ideologically, but they were still taking that money, right? So I read that and I think it just hits me with a combination of sort of a pretense at self-awareness, but at the same time, a complete willingness to profit from that very process. I don't know. These are sort of not fully formed thoughts, but just rereading that, it's like, oh, Pink Floyd, you really did want them to buy the bric-a-brac. You can make as many jokes as you want about it, but you wanted them to buy it too.
Right, and it goes back to what does Brit Row stand for? Brit Row Bric-a-brac, Britannia Row Bric-a-brac, because the original, and this is in Vernon's book, the Brit Row Brick Company was established as a side project for Britannia Row Lighting and Britannia Row Sound to order the bricks that were used to construct the wall in the live shows. So each brick is stamped with a Brit Row Bric-a-brac logo. The roadies would wear patches and things on their sleeves and on their shirts, indicating that. And they themselves are a part of this grand illusion. And you talk about, going back, Phil, you talk about how, Floyd, they were hunters. They use every part of the animal. There's an explicit line of text in this manuscript that reads, "Let's cannibalize anything useful from our old shows." And during Young Lust, they were talking about tawdy use of the stripper from Dark Side of the Moon during Young Lust. The Sea of Blood from Wish You Were Here being used during What Shall We Do Now? And of course, the pig comes back. And the pig is of course, the enigmatic symbol of the Floyd. And in the manuscript, the pig is given a name, Fleming, named after Graham Fleming, who was one of the architects of the wall, who was the original lighting designer before Mark Brickman came in and gave the show a do-over 12 hours before the band were supposed to go on, which is a monumental task, to say the least.
So if we take a look at the manuscript, if we take a look at the whole project, let's call it the Wall project, including the film, the movie, the live performances, the album, everything. It's fully a project from Roger Waters, I get it. And I think it's very interesting to see that after 1977, the Animals tour, everyone in the band was somehow angry, deflated, they didn't get together anymore. They all, there was some sort of a vacuum in the band, but not on Roger Waters. There's a line, "Take the anger and put it into the dance." And that's what Roger Waters did, I think. he used all the power he got, all the anger and everything he had inside of him, and created something out of it. And whatever you say about Roger Waters and whatever you think about Roger Waters, I mean, that's really pure energy.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think, again, trying to understand Roger Waters as a creative individual, as a human being, right? Frankly, it's so complex because there's this quote. What is it from Yeats? The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. There's always this, this issue with really that's just fundamental to the human condition. How do you balance in any artistic project? Let's confine it to the arts to make our life a lot simple. How do you balance, ambition and creative impulse and creative drive and the kind of, almost self-centeredness that's necessary to really bring a vision into existence versus something much more holistic, versus much more something more, patient. It's a difficult thing to put words to. And I think that the one thing we can come through all of this with a certainty about is that there were things that were made that depended on that burning ambition of Roger Waters to get made, right? I think, in other words, that was, again, it gets very tricky because, I'm someone who, for instance, I'm uncomfortable with the fact that Richard Wright did not get a writing credit on Sheep. I think he deserves one. I think when I think of Sheep, I think of that keyboard solo. And I am just personally, fundamentally uncomfortable with, frankly, the way that copyright law is written, such that, if you don't write the melody and you don't write the lyrics, you a lot of time you don't get a credit. To me, that doesn't reflect my own experience of music. And similarly, when I look at The Wall, to refer to the director Spike Lee, if the whole thing said at the bottom a Roger Waters joint, well, that wouldn't really be true, right? It's like, there's so much in there that is particularly of David Gilmour and of Ezrin as well, where it's like that's them putting their lifeblood into this music and giving it lyricism and relieving the relentless kind of one note nature of it. But at the same time, as Kyle points out, you go back and you listen to those demos. And by the way, gosh, do I wish we had all the demos, every demo version of this thing in its entirety, because we've got all of certain iterations of it and only parts of other iterations. And I think someone did a very nice chart maybe 10, 15 years ago, trying to figure it all out, what we did and didn't have. But there are just some things that are so striking. One of which, as Kyle said earlier, is the fact that the whole thing was really there from the beginning. And also, I suppose this is the time to mention this, although we'll talk about this maybe a little bit later when we talk about the last few bricks. There are things in that music which Roger Waters does things that I don't normally associate with Roger, in the sense that I typically see Richard Wright in particular as the person who was pushing way outside the band's normal harmonic bounds. But there are a couple tracks on The Wall, one in particular, again, I'll save that for the last few bricks discussion, where it's just completely unlike anything else Pink Floyd ever did before or afterwards. And so, yeah, ultimately, I think, let me put it this way. I think about Andy Jackson, and I think about him talking about being trapped in a room with Roger Waters for months on end, thinking, wow, what an experience in every sense of that phrase, right? What a positive experience in some ways, and what a challenging experience it must have been in other ways. But again, no one can ever accuse Roger of not being willing to put in the work that he's asking of everybody else. That's one thing he's immune from criticism on.
And we talk about being trapped in a room with Roger Waters for multiple months. The band begins the rehearsals of playing The Wall out as a piece of stage theater. And now there is the rehearsal tape that has come out that shows an average day or an average rehearsal for The Wall, which involves Roger as music director, as technical director, as the sort of brains behind the operation of the whole piece as a work of theater. And when you listen to those rehearsals, it is so glaringly, it's glaringly obvious why The Wall was so difficult to perform, and two, why this broke up the band, and in every sense of the word, because there's a lot of wonderful quotes you could pull from this rehearsal, including one that Vernon Fitch wrote in his book, which is, "You're cheating, you're fucking cheating, you wall builders, stop. You have to stop when we stop, or else we don't know what's going on." And that's to the point where when you really stop and think about it, okay, well, what does the band have to do on stage at any given moment? Perform the music, The bricklayers have to build the bricks and put them in the framework of the wall, literally brick by brick, piece by piece, and anytime the band stops, the bricklayers have to stop or everything is out of time. And Roger knows this the whole time that they're performing. And there's a few back and forths between James Guthrie and Roger about getting click tracks in the cans. Like, I can't hear any click, and it's difficult to do this without click. And going forward a little bit, people who wrote reviews about the concerts, they would talk about these mouse ears that Roger wears to keep track of the whole show, which is true because the click track was being fed through there, a number of other things were being fed through there. All communication is going directly to Roger, and he's the only one, he's the main one that keeps track of all this. And there's an interesting thing about the rehearsals where when I was listening to it, I realized something, that Empty Spaces and What Shall We Do Now are two completely separate songs. And the one that's performed in the live setting is What Shall We Do Now. And there's no empty spaces before, the wonderful drum, bow, 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 do, the whole thing that Willie and Nick do on stage. It's explicitly What Shall We Do Now from when the flowers show up on screen to when they start Young Lust. And the reason why is because in these rehearsals, Roger, for the only time he would ever do it in the entire tour and any other document we have, he sings the lyrics to the song known as Empty Spaces. What shall we use to fill the empty spaces? How shall I complete the wall? He sings that version of the song explicitly during these rehearsals and then goes into the lyrics of What Shall We Do Now. As written on the lyric sheet, what shall we do to fill the empty spaces where waves of hunger gnaw? And that whole portion, that's What Shall We Do Now. And obviously, I can't go back and rewrite all the bootlegs that have been put out that space the two as two separate things or whatever. But I feel like it's an interesting point to make that Empty Spaces as a song is not performed once in the live setting. It is just What Shall We Do Now, which was regrettably cut from the studio album due to time and has only ever surfaced in a studio sounding form with the movie.
And I think just to do a little housekeeping too, I think for listeners who might not know, what we're referring to is a tape that's typically attributed to February 1st, 1980, although I don't know whether that's actually been confirmed. Oh, I think somebody did, didn't they? Didn't they listen to the TV and figure out what some relationship between, maybe they were using a live TV feed and somebody actually figured out, yes, it was actually a show being broadcast at the right time.
It was originally a TV feed being piped in to the TV, and there's a whole section of this rehearsal where Roger's talking about setting up the TV, using a remote to turn it on, and that stuff's some of my favorite things. Roger working out, well, how do I get up there? How does this work? As if he hasn't been working vehemently with Mark Fisher and, Jonathan Park and Scarf and all those people to put this mad thing together. And it goes to the point where by the time the band was set to perform on February 7th, 1980, they had not done a single complete run through of the wall from start to finish without interruption.
I remember you told me that the other day, and that just absolutely shocked me. I mean, I put on a concert about a year and a half ago. Well, no, more like 9 months ago. And, I felt nervous about the fact that we never had a proper dress rehearsal. And that was only just a bunch of people getting up on stage and playing, flute and French horn and piano and the like. I can't imagine not having a complete dress. That's just terrifying.
And there was this problem where you could hear in the rehearsals, I can't remember when, I believe it's during the Thin Ice, I'll have to write a memorandum if I can remember where, you could hear this screeching sound that comes through one of the mics. It's very faint, but you could hear a mechanical screeching noise. Those were the genie lifts that were specifically engineered to lift the road crew up to keep building the wall. According to Fitch's numbook, they were that all the way until they were rehearsing at the LA Sports Arena, they were making this horrible noise every time that they would move up and down. And they had to oil and grease them for hours and hours and hours to get them to not make that sound. Because you can't go to a store and buy the equipment used to build the wall. Everything had to be hand machined and engineered in order to accomplish this one thing. And Mark Fisher was working on concepts for this as early as November of 1978. And that's over almost a year before the album would come out. So you have all these wonderful technical drawings by Fisher showing, well, how do we build this wall? Are the bricks going to come apart under certain pressures or conditions? Are we making them out of cardboard or whatnot? Every single little thing about the actual building of the wall, making sure it can stay up during the shows. All that has to be planned out. And we'll get into it when we talk about that first show, but you can make a very strong parallel between the premiere of Pink Floyd's magnum opus in Portsmouth in 1972 and the premiere of The Wall here in 1980.
Yeah, I think Brighton and then Portsmouth. Yeah,
that's right.
That's one thing that struck me, by the way, is that, I think you and I were talking about this the other day. It is so typical of Roger Waters and Pink Floyd to be tweaking things until the last minute. And we saw that with that string of the first shows in January 1972, where not only do we know that there were differences between the shows, we have a actual newspaper report telling us the band was changing things on their drive up to Brighton, which is just, again, it's just nuts. I would never dream of doing that, but that's how they did things.
I mean, just remember all these stunts and stories we got from Chris Cockram and all the guys working on the Animals tour in 1977. I mean, there were so many close calls and mishaps and everything. And if you listen to the Wall live rehearsals closely, I mean, they must have been horrified starting in February in Los Angeles. I mean, I can't believe how they thought it could go well.
Oh, one last bit of housekeeping, by the way, though. That tape that we mentioned, so this tape, the tape of the rehearsal, it cuts off at The Show Must Go On. And, one assumes that if it was recorded with authorization, there must be more. I remember in the late 90s, there was somebody, and I can't remember who it was, who said they had the rest of it. So if you are out there and, because this tape, it's a soundboard recording, it's actually pretty listenable. It's got some hiss, but other than that, it doesn't sound, sounds about like what you would expect. But if somewhere out there is somebody who has a tape that has the rest of it, there are a lot of people who would love to hear it. And who knows what fresh tortures Roger Waters inflicted on his collaborators and employees. Kyle, there was maybe one more thing to mention about how that rehearsal tape showed up.
Yes, this is very interesting. Thanks to Romain of Rare Pink Floyd, he kindly sent over a litany of documents relating to the Wall tour, concert reviews, the whole 9 yards, and it's so fascinating to read how many people disliked these shows vehemently, Nick Kent and Alan Jones of Melody Maker, but mysteriously Carl Dallas wrote in a 1981 interview about the shows. It's called Cracks in the Wall. There is an excerpt of text that is typed in this 1981 show review that is verbatim an interaction that happens in the LA rehearsals. It's between Roger, David Gilmour, and Graham Fleming talking about David, before the quote that's in this newspaper, David is trying to talk about getting more light on the keyboardist side behind the wall, getting more light on Rick's side. And Roger goes, "It's stage left," correcting David as he's known to do over the PA. And Graham Fleming says, "We don't have room for that on the board." That quote from the LA rehearsals is verbatim picked out for this 1981 article on the shows. So if people who are into the art of sleuthing for these type of things, if Carl Dallas is still out there somewhere, I would hazard to guess that the Wall rehearsals tape could potentially have come from Dallas. We don't really know, of course, but you can make a fairly inferred guess, at least, based on that specific quote being pulled for a show that would happen a year and a half later.
There's one other possibility that comes to my mind, which, I think about, among other things. There's a famous tape of the drummer Buddy Rich absolutely berating his band on the tour bus. So how do we have that? Well, somebody associated with the production leaked it because they wanted to show what Buddy Rich was like behind the scenes. Fantastic drummer. And I actually happened to talk about him with Jerry Shirley, but definitely a person who at best had such high standards that he could be very nasty to the people around him if he felt like those standards weren't being met. Gee, who does that remind me of? If only I could think of somebody else who had the same qualities. So, I wonder if it really did circulate that early, right? And that quickly. Mick the Hat has talked about a little bit about how some things that we have came into circulation, about how, if you knew the right person, da-da-da-da-da-da. But if it came into circulation that quickly, it really makes me wonder whether people were passing it around going essentially, hey, get a load of this jerk. And that was the intention. And I don't know, I really have no idea, but it could be that it was a combination of, enjoying the music, enjoying the people behind the scenes, but also a little bit of what's the word I want to use? Not revenge, that's not quite right, but a little bit of sort of a peek behind the curtain as if to say, hey, look at what we have to put up with. And that little bit of headcanon speculating, I don't know, has kind of the ring of truth to me, but only the author of that article will be able to say for sure.
And of course, with that, we go into the first show, February 7th in Los Angeles. We have a Master of Ceremonies, which is Cynthia Fox from KMET. She does a lovely, enthusiastic little opener about, oh, the band is getting ready to go. And it's nothing like Gary Udman, who we will talk about as we go to New York. But at this point, it was just a standard, radio DJ starting the show. The show begins. Well, there's a problem when the show begins. Either, according to most reports, it is either a firework that is shot off at the start of In the Flesh, or when the Stuka comes down from the back of the arena and hits the wall, there's another pyrotechnic that goes off, and the curtains that are behind the wall directly catch fire. And the fire rages on through the first half, pretty much undetected until about Mother, where you hear the sound of fire extinguishers coming over the PA. And James Guthrie at one point talked about how he was scrambling across the soundboard trying to find where the sound was coming from, because the whole thing, there are 106 microphone inputs on stage, including delay and reverb. And if you've been rehearsing The Wall for 2 months and Roger's been talking about the sound, getting click track at his cans and whatnot, if you hear this sound that you don't recognize, you probably would start to panic. Eventually, during the beginning of What Shall We Do Now, as the animation starts playing, there's a call on stage. Roger goes, whoa, 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 stop, stop, stop. And the band stops in their tracks. And Roger says, I think it's a good idea for us to put this fire out that we've got going on up here. So if we could bring the house lights up, please. And they bring it up. And how close, as Chris Cockrum talked about in the Animals tour, how close they were to disaster on so many occasions. This is no exception. Just like during the beginning of Money and that fateful show in Brighton in 1972, they have to stop the show midway through. And the fact that you have over 400 6-foot long and 2-foot deep pieces of cardboard waiting to be assembled backstage for the wall, and cardboard is incredibly flammable, and the wall is made of cardboard, they avoided a horrible disaster by probably minutes when Roger decides to stop the show. Roger talks about a roadie by the name of Rocky, who is Rocky Paulson, who also worked on the Animals tour, actually. He was the rigging engineer behind all the inflatables for that tour. He talks about Rocky Paulson jumping from curtain to curtain with a fire extinguisher under his arm and trying to put out the flames as the band is performing on stage. And as much as we talk about Roger, and his anger and the way his anger works towards the music, he has a fantastic stage presence to him that he was able to calm the audience down pretty much. And, he makes jokes about the fire right as it's done. 1, 2, wasn't that exciting? Now, can we go back to that bit in the story where there's a moon in front of the clouds and the clouds are there in front of the moon and the audience roars and they're excited? You remember that bit, Andy? And he's talking about Andy Shields, a projectionist who's probably having to scramble through this piece of film to find the start of where the clouds are passing in front of the moon. And eventually the band gets back on track and the show can continue. But that isn't without the click track bleeding into the PA on a number of occasions, even going back to Another Brick in the Wall 2. You could hear the sound of this click, 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 and a count in, and there's Brick 2 being performed with a click track coming over the PA. And it happens so many times throughout the show that by the time you get to Comfortably Numb, it's a remixed version of the song. You have the click that's playing through almost the entire thing, and it's not until the middle of Gilmour's second solo where it's finally cut. Mm-hmm. And, of course, Roger more than likely was very frustrated with the idea that his magnum opus had to be stopped midway through. But again, thank goodness that everybody was so used to hearing him shout the word stop.
Exactly. I think, you made a great point the other day when we chatted about that, the fact that he had that stage presence. I mean, the band had both technical disasters, but actually this wasn't the first time they had a genuinely dangerous situation. Unfortunately, we only have about 4 minutes of this show, but there was a performance. It was the second performance during their US tour of 1973 at Cobo Hall in Detroit, where the way I remember it, and again, this is one of those things where much as with the spitting incident, where we now know that Roger spat on the fan during Money because we, against all odds, have documentary evidence. This is something that I think there's been a few different stories told about it, and there's been some recent narratives that have been published that have sort of helped clarify some details. But the basic gist of it is that there was an incident with the pyrotechnics. And when they went off during Careful Without Axe Eugene, they went off so powerfully. A couple people were injured. They could have been maimed, easily, but instead they were just, I think, mildly to moderately injured in the front row of the audience. And they absolutely annihilated about half of their PA. So there's this great, you can find it if you look around on the internet, there's this great narrative of them, of the band's crew scrambling and calling every, audio house they knew of to try to get equipment to replace what they'd lost, and managing somehow to put together a rig in time for the show in St. Louis the following day, which we, by the way, have a complete bootleg of, and it sounds a little funny. It doesn't sound quite right. So that would maybe help to explain it. I think they probably needed a few more days to iron things out. By the time we get to the famous Toronto performance about 4 days later, 4 days later, 5 days later, then it starts sounding really good. But, so the band had been in a dangerous situation before. And granted, that was one where it was kind of a fait accompli once the explosion happened. It was just a matter of picking it up. They would obviously be in one later with the famous stand collapse at Earl's Court in 1994. But I think you made an excellent point that Roger Waters' commanding presence may have gone some way to both keeping the audience under control and making sure that when Roger said stop, everybody, jumped. And the other thing too is that, the flip side of that is that we've had so many reports. You mentioned the person getting fired 12 hours before the start of the show. That was another rodeo they'd done before, where in 1974, a sound man, I won't say his name because why compound his humiliation, but he was great in the studio. But then when he was tapped to do the 1974 British tour, those early shows don't have great sound. And then when they got to the big shows at Wembley, the first show was a disaster. It was trashed, and I think it was New Musical Express. And we don't have a bootleg of it, although a tape does exist. And they had to fire the guy, and they brought in somebody on like no notice and replaced him, and everything was swimmingly fine before that. So that was another time that they'd sort of done that rodeo before.
And that contributor it was Graham Fleming, who was in charge of the lighting. I don't think he was fired because the pig is lovingly named after him. I don't think he was totally uninvolved.
So they just moved him to a different station or something like that.
Basically, they moved him to a different station. But Mark Brickman is responsible for the bulk of the blocking in these shows, and I'll talk about the blocking when the Wall comes to New York. But having to almost completely re-engineer the Wall after months of rehearsals and 12 hours before the band would go on stage, that is an incredible, insurmountable feat. Like I mentioned before, just the idea of you have to reblock Roger's almost magnum opus and how particular he is on every single aspect of it, and getting his approval in the end to have these changes. It's wonderful. And of course, with this stop in this show in LA, the bricklayers are a little behind on finishing the Wall before we get to Another Brick in the Wall 3 and Goodbye Cruel World. So the band begins the Last Few Bricks jam, and it is, in simple terms, fucking spectacular. To me, at least, I think it is absolutely spectacular. It's the last time, I believe, that the Floyd would jam to this capacity for the rest of their careers. And it's a very wonderful 12, almost 13 minutes of just all right, well, we have to pad out some time. Let's give them all we have and just rock out. And it's fantastic.
Yeah, I was spending some time listening to that today. And I mean, I guess this is a chance for me to talk a little bit about The Last Few Bricks, which the main thing, I guess, about it that I want to say is, one, again, it serves kind of, although coming in a funny place structurally, it serves much the function that an overture does in opera, where it's sort of, except it's a summation rather than an anticipation. There's also material in there that's unique, right? In other words, in the composed version of The Last Few Bricks, which I don't remember Vernon Fitch and Richard Mahan saying much about how that material was put together.
I think there is a section on it in the book.
There's a little bit, but I don't think they say like literally who wrote it, because there's material there that's not present in the Wall otherwise. It just isn't. It's clearly, some of it is derived from, of all things, Don't Leave Me Now. And I want to just take a little bit of a side trip to talk about that song. Along with Vera and Bring the Boys Back Home, it seems to be the song that comes in for the most opprobrium. I think that's the word I want. It's criticized so much by Pink Floyd fans. They say, oh, that's the one song I can't stand on the first two sides. I love Don't Leave Me Now. And you know what? It was part of the Wall from a very early stage. I think the very earliest demos had that. I think harmonically, it is completely unlike anything else they ever did. It's closer to almost like a piece by like Bartok or Prokofiev or something like that. It's got a very, very adventurous harmonic language, using lots of things like augmented chords and minor major seventh chords for people who know what those things are. But it's so singular. It's one of the few things in their entire recorded body of work that nothing else sounds like it. So I love it for that, for that reason, among others. But also, it's interesting that of all the material to quote from the first half, the last few bricks, the composed parts of it lean pretty heavily on material that's clearly derived from Don't Leave Me Now, right? It's like you got chords that are just the only thing that they have anything in common with from the preceding 45 minutes, or more than that, actually, more like 55, is that. So that's really interesting. And I think that that's another kind of little research project, is to really, for somebody to transcribe all the details of the last few bricks, which, by the way, I should add, it also has some anticipations too. There are also, I think, some things that hint at stuff we hear in the second half, although the most obvious things are connections to Another Brick in the Wall, part one, to Empty Spaces, even though it's not actually the same as the album version, to say the least. Again, I won't reopen that can of worms, but I think we know where it is. And then Young Lust is also prominently referenced. The other thing, I was just listening to that last few bricks from the 7th of February, 1980, and it reminds me of the 20th of November, 1971, among other shows. There's actually a few shows where Pink Floyd were kind of caught out and had to jam. Another one is Hunter College, the 5th of November, 1971, where they had a similar problem with Richard Wright's keyboard rig and the PA. But the jam that they do is kind of the same for a lot of it. It's the same 2-chord jam with minor 1, major 4, the same basic deal. And that's a tradition that just goes way, way back for them. There are things that happen there too, which are sort of singular. There's a little bit of bass playing, which reminds me of nothing so much as the unique version of Echoes we have on Live at Pompeii, where Roger kind of cuts it off by going right, and then plays all his open bass strings. And then this is the part I'd sort of forgotten. I remembered all that, but listening to it today, they basically go into a jam band groove. Like, for all the world, it sounds like Fish in 1997 or 1998 with their cowfunk phase. It's like, oh my gosh, they sound like a jam band, which Pink Floyd does not normally do at all. By the time they stopped jamming, the jam band sound, they stopped jamming, let's say, before the jam band sound and what became the jam band sound had really crystallized. But yeah, it's just a wild experience listening to that. And I'd say the people who hate The Wall should at least go back and listen to that part to hear, and again, we have to remind ourselves, these tours, and especially that last show in 1981, they were almost the last time we ever saw those 4 people on stage together ever. So there's always going to be that bittersweet element to it.
And a couple other things before we move on from the 7th that are worth about this show. The trial is performed without a backing vocal. And this is one of my favorite things to talk about when it comes to The Wall. The trial is my favorite track on The Wall, for those of you who potentially have known me in a past life who know this. The trial is this wonderful piece of Roger Waters' vocal prowess. He should have been a voice actor. I stand by that fact, because the trial is clear evidence of this. In the Perform Live manuscript, there's one line that reads something to the effect of, "Don't worry about, it'll all be tracked to tape, so no worry about the fuzz guitars and vocals, ja." And I don't know why he writes a little bit with a German intonation. I don't know. Let us peek into the mind of Roger Waters and find out. But by the time Roger gets to the trial, he is struggling to sing, and that's not a surprise. He just did The Wall for an hour and a half and put his entire body into it after months of rehearsing prior. And David Gilmour at one point has to come in when the mother starts singing her part to pick up the slack because Roger can't keep up. And it's interesting, this idea that at some point David Gilmour would have sung more of the trial, because as it stands throughout, from I think the 3rd show in LA all the way to the end of the tour, the trial is almost exclusively always a pre-recorded vocal track, which is the first time Roger would ever use such a thing in his career, and the first time he would use it in sort of the beginning of what people would call a bad trend. But the trial as performed on the 7th being just Roger and David, and Roger sings the whole judge's part in a more of a nasally sort of, "the evidence before the court is," and it doesn't match how weird the animation looks at all, but but he sings it, and by God, the wall comes down at the end. They do Outside the Wall, And Roger sounds absolutely relieved. He never says thank you more times to the audience than he does. He goes, "Thank you, that's it. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Good night." And then the band leaves, and it's the end of the show. And what a first show to this mechanical monster that would be put on the road. Of course, only in 4 cities, because it was terribly expensive to put on. The band lost money every night doing it.
I mean, if we talk about The Wall, we should not forget that they had a #1 hit on the radio. Something was very different. And I mean, maybe even the audience was very different. I mean, all the hardcore fans being at Pink Floyd live shows from the late 60s on, it was not the same anymore. They were a big radio super band. And maybe because it was so theatrical, the complete audience somehow shifted from regular or old school Pink Floyd fans to like new. I mean, it started even with Dark of the Moon, where they just call out for money, money, money and everything. But again, I think on The Wall, it went even further.
Absolutely. I mean, Derek Chaharn in his episode, he talks about how fans from that period, as they started phasing out Careful What That Axe Eugene and started phasing out Set the Controls, they would miss the presence of those songs. So as you get into 1974, well, now the first half is stuff, like Raving and Drooling and You Gotta Be Crazy, but then the second half is Dark Side of the Moon. You get to 1977, the first half is Animals, and the second half is Wish You Were Here, performed in its entirety. So the audience shift definitely did happen, if Derek's testimony is to say anything of it, and I think it does, because the man is incredibly well-versed in the Floyd in many regards. But there's also this idea that the audience, they knew what they were there for in some ways, because when we go to some of the shows in New York, February 25th, 26th, and 27th, those 3 shows, they start cheering when Brick One starts because they know what's coming, which is the single that they've been hearing on the radio, which was the #1 single for, my God, like 15 weeks or something like that. Or maybe it was the album that was on #1 for that long. But there's a moment in one of these New York shows, I know we're getting to there, but the audience at some point, they start singing during Mother, and they sing My Balls with Roger, this massive audience of people in New York going, My Balls, in time with the music. And that became sort of this weird internet joke related to the Floyd way, way later on. But in 1980, they knew what they were there for. They were there for these songs that they had started to hear on the radio, like Another Brick in the Wall 2, potentially Mother, Hey You, Run Like Hell. They were there for those specific songs in the repertoire and just got a smashing rock show on top of it.
I mean, and the show itself foregrounds the audience, right? I mean, in other words, I think it's maybe not a coincidence that we began to hear that kind of participation. And, when he would sing Mother Should I Trust the Government at plenty of shows, the crowd immediately, and they're not booing the Floyd, they're booing the notion that's being put forth, but I mean, the whole thing is, I guess you would use the word a contrivance, right? In other words, the idea that this is all stagecraft and a spectacle is built into it from the ground up. I mean, again, yeah, the kind of people who were going to see The Wall were looking for something and expecting something that's fundamentally different than the Floyd were offering. Even in 1977, because I was thinking about it, and I guess you could say the Dark Side of the Moon was pretty, stage managed. But in 1977, there was enough wiggle room that Roger Waters could tell Snowy White, hey, maybe we jam a little bit less long-windedly tonight. Apparently Roger, if anything, wanted to tighten it up and was getting not irritated, but he was in some way finding it objectionable that Snowy White was playing for longer than I guess he deemed the platonic ideal of that balancing act to happen. But yeah, I think also, as we sort of stand between the LA shows and the New York shows, I think I went through my notes that I have for a lot of these shows, and sort of, I think one of the things that I really notice is how much they improve as a given run goes on. It almost feels like when they go to a new venue, everything starts back from scratch to a degree. I think actually they get up and running in full flight a little sooner at Nassau Coliseum than they did in LA. But I think, yeah, if you go through and you kind of make a list, I mean, that it can be easy to get in the wrong mindset when you listen to a lot of these shows. You count the mistakes rather than the high points. And I mean, and in fairness, I think that that's partly because we're talking about something that was by design meant to be a consistent product that had a consistent impact on the audience in a consistent ways, right? So when, in other words, there's, when the ideal is perfection as opposed to transcendence, right? Those are two different things. If you get on stage and you're looking to find transcendence through jamming, improvisation, and a kind of a way of accessing a person's subconscious, let's call it, that's more nonverbal, right? Then you're going to have a different kind of set of feelings about comparing shows to shows. Whereas with The Wall, you kind of get the feeling that Roger Waters has a platonic ideal of how he wants things to go. And so the only thing, it's almost like a piece of classical music, although classical music actually has much more room for interpretation in many ways than Roger gave his colleagues on The Wall, because among other things, classical music doesn't use a click track, right? So you can have variations of tempo, interpretation, night to night. The Wall is really not too much for that to happen. So I think, some impressions I have is, first of all, it just gets better with every performance. And there's some real disasters in some of these shows. And I'm not just talking about the first one. Times that like Roger is just not singing the right things. He's in the wrong key, or he's on the wrong beat because he's listening to his click track instead of listening to the musicians he's playing with. And so he just comes in, what that means when you search for this kind of complete control, if it all goes well, that's great. But if something goes wrong, it leads to much bigger disasters than we have actually ever seen before on a Pink Floyd stage. Not counting maybe some performances with Sid that we don't have, and we can only take people's word for it that they were disastrous. But in terms of the idea of this is an entertainment event that has certain beats that need to be hit successfully, and if they are, then people feel rewarded. The Wall obviously has a lot more of them, but they just go wrong in a way that you almost never hear from the Floyd. I think when you listen to a lot of concerts by the Floyd between even 1968, but let's say 1970 to 1977, you listen to a bunch of concerts by them, and then you listen to concerts by, I love them dearly, but Led Zeppelin or The Doors or Jefferson Airplane. You'll hear some really unprofessional concerts from those bands, or at least sections of those concerts where it's like, no, Jimmy Page was in no condition, or Jim Morrison was in no condition, or Grace Slick was in no condition to be doing what they were trying to do that night. You don't get that from Pink Floyd. You really don't. Every night they bring, at worst, every night they're B+, right? I mean, and just judged in kind of marketplace professional terms. You never get the feeling they're coming up and kind of half-assing it, and and I think the closest I can think of to that is one of my absolute favorite shows of theirs, 27th of November, 1970, where they are either drunk as skunks or high as kites, or something is going on, because they play every single song as if it's the funniest and jammiest thing out there. And it's just an absolutely fabulous show where they're just completely off their gourd. But then, with these Wall shows, there are just places where it's just a complete mess. And sometimes it's Roger, and sometimes things are just muted. You mentioned the click track bleeding through. I think the show of the LA shows that struck me as the best was actually the next to last one, the 12th. I think that was the one where I remember listening to it and saying, this feels like they're finally there. Like, yes, there are still little things happening here and there, but this is the first performance of all the LA shows. And as a reminder, by the way, just in case anybody doesn't know, the Wall shows, we're actually missing one. It was allegedly taped by somebody who left it in their car, and their car was stolen. That's my understanding. So I believe it's February 11th, which is a particularly important day for Pink Floyd fans, because 10 years prior, in Birmingham, they played one of their most important and unique concerts. But that's the one concert from all these Wall shows we do not have. And we can only, I think people remembered well enough to be able to transcribe Waters' comments before Run Like Hell, I think it was, in Young Lust. But basically speaking, that's the one we don't have. And just similarly, to finish up quickly, you can really hear in Nassau Coliseum as well how, on certain nights, like I think there are 5 nights at Nassau Coliseum. The third one, the trial is a mess. The tape player is not working correctly. It goes, I mean, it's comic, actually. It's the kind of thing where, and literally someone shouts, "What the hell is going on?" As if to say, like, hey, come on, you're Pink Floyd. This stuff isn't supposed to happen. There are other nights where Roger is just completely, off the mark. And then all of a sudden on the 27th, boom, it snaps into place, where it's like, okay, this is clicking into place. David is obviously, when you hear David start laughing, it's either a very bad sign or a very good sign. So in this case, David cracks up during David Gilmour, I should say, cracks up during Hey You, which is a nice thing to hear. So it just seems like suddenly, at these Nassau shows, a little bit sooner, like it kind of locks into place, and then with every iteration of the tour, it gets a little more professional, a little more together.
I totally understand everything you say, and I totally get it, but still, it somehow contradicts what everyone told me in the past, even inside the podcast, on a personal level. They all told me, yeah, Pink Floyd live, what an experience, the music, improvisations, even in 1977. But then, if they told me something about the Wall, they went to the Wall shows. The only thing they told me about was the show itself and not the music. They they even told me, some of them, that they thought it would be
Mm.
from tape, and it would be tape because it was very perfect. Of course, there were no improvisations, I get that, but they did not really talk about the live music at all. So yeah, we have all these mishaps, and we have all the recordings, and we
Hmm.
know what went wrong, and
Right.
we listened here, we listened there. But I think being there at that time, you were totally overwhelmed by the show itself, and the music was just
Yes.
the second most important thing, at least.
Hmm.
And this goes to the sentiment that, even, I mean, we go back to that first show in the February 7th show. Right as the fire happens, you could hear people. I think it's recorder one. You could hear a couple people go, "What a fire, folks! What a fire!" And then one of the tapers says, "I think some of this is put on tape." They knew, the audience knew from the first show in Los Angeles, that there is something going on where there's stuff that's on tape, that was meant to be on tape. And we talk about, of course, the idea of, well, it sounds like it's all played on tape. It can't possibly be live. The surrogate band, as put at the front of the show during the first In the Flesh, was supposed to be this idea of a shadow group replacing the Pink Floyd. And it was Roger's idea. Well, he could just go play golf or whatever, and the money could keep rolling in while the surrogate band goes and does the job of the Floyd. So much so that there's Andy Bone, I think it's Andy Bone, Willie Wilson, Snowy White, and Peter Wood. They're on stage wearing life cast masks of the band members during the first number, during In the Flesh. And if you didn't know that, you probably would have assumed, yeah, that's Pink Floyd up there.
Hmm.
But of course, and again, in the great art of theater that the Wall is, and I guess now is a good point to go into the 27th videotape that we have, because that reveals more about the staging of the show and the way things look. Because before then, there's a couple of Super 8 documents, I think, that have surfaced. I haven't seen them because I'm not really all that up to speed on the Wall. Maybe I should be. But um, other than a couple of Super 8 reels from dates prior to it, the 27th of February 1980 is the first Wall show that we have video for. And not only is the first Wall show we have video for, it is probably one of the most important Floyd video documents. Why? It is a Pink Floyd show from start to finish, with no overdubs, no edits, no cuts. You're seeing it and hearing it exactly, almost, well, maybe minus the quad sound effects and whatnot, but generally speaking, you are seeing this exactly as the audience would have seen it, given the vantage point of the two cameras that were on the floor that night. And of course, because it's an unfiltered, unedited experience, it is such a wild thing to watch, because you're watching The Wall and you're seeing all these things that happen. And of course, we'll see in the Divided We Fall bootleg from Harvested, the 1980 shows in London, to a much more intimate degree, but that's for different reasons we'll get into. But this show at Nassau, when I started watching it again, I was taken aback by just how deliberate everything is. And I don't just mean, well, okay, so the band is going to play these numbers and the wall's going to go up. Well, what about the idea that they engineered these keyholes in the wall, where you see David and Snowy in one little keyhole on the left side of the stage right. Center stage is this massive hole where Roger can waltz in and out of and rock back and forth on his little steps during Don't Leave Me Now. And there's, Willie Wilson, Nick Mason behind him. And then there's an even smaller window for Rick Wright and Peter Wood. And of course, this goes back to the whole, well, Roger gives himself this big old grandiose thing to walk around in front of, and the rest of the band are stuck behind the wall as intended, as written, as planned. And just watching stuff like, for example, The Happiest Days of Our Lives, the way that the cherry picker lights come up to mimic the helicopter lights, and then there are these big swooping thoughts over the audience, and then there's the teacher already mid-hunch, slowly inching his way towards center stage. That's the stuff that rock and roll dreams are made of. This is the stuff that people have remembered for 40 plus years on, is stuff like that, where you have these massive props, these it's not just like the nuclear family on the Animals tour, the big pig that comes over. Every 10 to 15 minutes, there's something like that happening in the wall. The teacher coming in, or the mother positioned in such a way where, given the perspective of where the mother is sitting, it looks like she's sitting on top of the wall with her arms crossed. And she only appears right when the music calls for it, the right moment, the spotlight hits her, and it's this wow moment where you're like, what is this? When did this show up? It's all disguised in darkness and with cleverly placed lights, where you never see anything too early, you never see anything too late. And that Nassau show, that video illustrates that to such an important degree. I mean, even down to the Stuka coming down at the start of In the Flesh, that's all planned. You have the tape sound of the plane coming down copied directly from the master tapes of the studio album. And there it is, coming from the back left of the arena all the way to the front right, where it crashes in the wall in spectacular fashion. I mean, it's all so meticulously planned out, beat for beat, moment for moment. To me, it's undeniable that without the wall as a piece of rock theater, you wouldn't have the U2 tours of the 90s. You wouldn't have the Rolling Stones tours of the 80s in that era. Floyd's spectacle in 87 would not exist if not for the wall. As much as the band sort of whinges about, oh, it's this big theater thing, and Roger's building this wall up in front of the audience, pissing everybody off, without that, you wouldn't have the rock spectacle as it became. It is quite literally the cornerstone of what was to come. And, you watch stuff like the lighting of blocking. I used to be in it was community theater, but I used to be in theater. And I remember many lighting rehearsals where we would block actors on stage. Okay, well, an actor's got to stand here in order to get this effect with the light behind them. The wall is that tenfold, 20-fold, because even down to the lighting and the way things drop in and out and the way that colors play with the silhouettes of the band on stage, it's so deliberate and it's so fucking impressive. That is even talking about, well, what happens after the wall goes up? There's a hotel room in the wall that had to be engineered for Roger to recline on this big recliner and watch television. And if you look at pictures of the intermission or pictures from the pre-show, it fits so perfectly in the wall's infrastructure. It's like it isn't even there. You can't even see it, but eventually it comes out at the right moment, and Roger's sitting there singing Nobody Home in one of the most spectacular visuals of the whole show for how simple and effective it is.
You mentioned something the other day about, wasn't there something that I think was abandoned where they wanted Nick Mason to kind of pop out?
And that's in the rehearsal tape, Roger, and during the song Is There Anybody Out There? And I understand for our viewers, this is a audio podcast about The Wall Live, which is such a visual show. So if you want to see some of these things for yourself, I encourage you to go find that Nassau Coliseum video, go find the Earl's Court video and watch it for yourself to really get an idea of this work of theater being put on. But during Is There Anybody Out There, David Gilmour plays the acoustic number through a tiny little hole in the wall. And originally, Roger had this idea that during Bring the Boys Back Home, Nick Mason was going to be with two big crash cymbals, in time, bring the boys back home, doing this whole thing. And it's like Nick is one of those little clapper monkey toys,
Exactly. Yeah, it's like a prop.
Just crashing the cymbals together.
He's like a prop. And I think that's, when I think about the wall as theater, I think one of the things that makes it maybe a little uncomfortable or maybe divides it from some of what the Floyd ended up doing later on, which is always, very spectacular and very big. But I think it's that turning of the band members themselves into characters or props, or I think that at the very least, I mean, there are some moments they embrace, right? In other words, I have to imagine that David Gilmour loves having the spotlight shine on him when he comes in Uncomfortably Numb. I mean, he must feel like, like an archangel come down from heaven, the crowd greeting him rapturously. It's probably, just by crowd reaction, it seems to be just pretty close to everybody's favorite moment. But, for Richard Wright or Nick Mason to be sort of treated that way, at the very least, it doesn't seem to manifest anything which would be consistent with an inner drive on their part to be spotlighted in that particular way, which is, a fancy way to say, I mean, if it were me, I'd feel a little bit like I was in a fourth grade play. So I think that, I suppose there are questions about micromanagement, about the level of control, about the degree to which a person's part reflects something inward from them, as opposed to playing a character in someone else's, what is really actually someone else's interior psychological drama. But yeah, I think when I think about the way in which these shows were prone to technical problems that were gradually worked out, we talked earlier about the idea that trying to assert a high level of control leads to disaster. I think one thing I was really struck by too, by the way, parenthetically, I know I'm a little bit all over the place, but parenthetically, when people check out those videos from Nassau and Earl's Court, remember that you're hearing a soundboard mix. Or in the case of Earl's Court, you're hearing a soundboard mix. I don't remember what the nature of the recording was in Nassau, but in any event, I seem to remember.
I think it's open air mics.
It's open air, yeah.
It's like a mono. Interference, yeah.
Do we have any copies that are stereo, or are they all mono?
I think they're all mono, as far as I know. I can't remember. It's funny. I don't usually note whether or not something's in stereo when I listen to it. It's weird. Usually, as a bootleg enjoyer, you kind of do normally, but for me, for the wall, I'm just straight. I'm watching it.
Well, that's the thing. If you're watching it, you can get away with audio quality that's so much lower if you have a compelling visual to go with it. I mean, there's actually a shocking number of recordings released by bands who would never dream of releasing something audio only in a given quality. But as soon as you pair it with a good visual, it's like no one seems to mind. It's like as long as they have something to keep their eyes busy, they'll tolerate what bootleggers would call, VG minus audio, because it just goes with the audio. But yeah, I would make the point briefly that if anyone does go out and check out these two videos, one we just talked about from Nassau Coliseum, the other one later in the year from Earl's Court, which we'll talk about shortly, please keep in mind that you're hearing a subset of what anyone at these shows would have heard, and actually a really well done synchronization between that feed and audience recorders will give you a much more compelling impression. Some people have done some work in that direction. It gives you a much more compelling impression of what it was actually like to be at that show. And I'm someone who underestimated that stuff for a long time. It really didn't click for a long time how important, stereo imaging and a well-balanced sound could be, and how much more, we think about things like a lack of hiss or a lack of distortion or a crisp top end and things like that. But it's actually the immersiveness of recording has so much to do. I'm at the point now where I'd rather hear two bad mono recordings synced up to make stereo than a really crisp, mono point source a lot of the time. I just feel like I'm much more present at the recording, at the concert, if I have that stereo image.
Okay, I have to ask you something, and maybe you really get angry and you're not going to talk to me ever again, but...
Which one of us?
What I would like to know, I mean, if you have a regular live band and you play like 200, 250 shows a year, the only way of being emotionally able to do that, in my opinion, is the connection to the audience. And the interaction between you and the audience, the fans and everything. And playing the wall live, you are behind a wall. It completely contradicts the whole thing about having a live show. So, having all these problems, the light, building up the wall and everything, and then playing as a band behind the wall. Maybe not Roger Waters and maybe not David Gilmour on Comfortably Numb, but in the end they were behind a wall. Why did they even bother playing live? I don't really get it. I mean, they had two options. Option one would have been not to play it live at all. Having it completely from tape, nobody would have cared, nobody would have realized, I think. Or the second option would have been having another band playing it. The wall live, powered by Pink Floyd, or whatever, or Roger Waters, not even Pink Floyd. So my question to you, was it necessary to play it live?
I can take a shot at it. One reason is that partly because of the limitations of technology at the time, it was just sort of assumed. Like, in other words, they didn't think to ask the question that they could not do so. Although at the same time, I think that those issues were very much on their mind. I mean, I think when we talk about the people, wearing the masks, I think it's partly kind of a screw you to the audience. Like, screw you, you wouldn't know the difference if we weren't even here. right?
Mhm.
So, I mean, there's this profound ambivalence about the relationship between the band and the audience, and this desire to connect mixed up with this complete, I don't want to say contempt for the audience. That's not the right word for it, but this attitude towards them, which is extremely adversarial, and not in a punk way, more in a, your uncle at Thanksgiving dinner lecturing everybody kind of way. So, I mean, yeah, there are times that we're talking about that all this, that it makes me think, well, geez, we sound a lot like we're talking about the laser light show at the planetarium, don't we? Right. I mean, in the sense that, everything goes off perfectly, right? It's like everybody oohs and ahs at the right moments, and it's not, there's nothing spontaneous about it, at all, maybe.
But to me, that is the compelling argument for The Wall. That is the compelling argument that, yes, it's a band playing basically underneath this mechanical infrastructure, that if anything goes wrong, the whole show comes to a grinding halt and you can't do anything about it. It's that anxiety of getting everything just right, or just right enough, that as Roger affectionately calls them, the punters won't notice.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why, and all of it is a sort of pastiche of what came before with the Pink Floyd as this band. What is in the flesh with this surrogate band? The ooh and ah of the idle demagoguing for the band, but it's not really the band at all. It plays with that audience expectation in such a way that, yeah, of course they could wear these masks and no one would know, because the Floyd were a faceless band. They could walk through the crowd onto stage in the mid-70s and no one would know it was them. And that's why that works. And we go back to the master of ceremonies at this point in New York. It's Gary Yudman. Actually, Cynthia Fox, I have to go back to February 7th, because she says something during the second half, during her secondary preliminary before In the Flesh Part 2, where the band are back in front of the stage with the surrogates. She talks about, the band have had a busy day, and they're in their hotel rooms, and they're signing autographs and entertaining groupies, and signing autographs and entertaining groupies. I don't think the Floyd really were the type of group to sign autographs all day. By most accounts that I've heard, they liked ghost signing for each other, where they would hand an article to one of the band members and the other member would make a facsimile signature that looks exactly like, say, Nick would sign for Rick or David would sign for Nick, and that kind of thing. But there's never the sense that the Floyd are the type of group to, talk to. I mean, they probably did talk to groupies and engage with them a lot. If Summer '68 is of any indication of that, the greatest sob story about a groupie ever written. But of course, there's Gary Yudman on that stage, not like Ron Geeson when he was performing with Genesis in 1974, being the guy on stage directly connected to the band, taking the fire from the audience. Right. Here's Gary Yudman as a proxy, doing his whole, welcome to Nassau Coliseum, and he's that sort of chipper American, sportscaster type rap that he does.
And isn't it uncomfortable to listen to Cynthia Fox be taking the heat? Isn't it interesting? I feel a lot more uncomfortable listening to
it really is.
Yeah, there's something about it. It feels wrong.
There's a moment where she jokes in that same speech where she goes, and the band's manager comes up to me and says, hey, can you do me a big favor? Well, I've already got my backstage pass. No, not that kind of favor. The manager asked me to stall for time. How can I entertain you? And someone in the audience way, way off screams, take your shirt off. And she even pauses on stage and she nervously laughs it off. And it's something so uncomfortable about it. Yeah. But in that way, it's very rock and roll, isn't it? It's very rock and roll.
I guess. Maybe it's very 1980.
I mean, if we talk about Dortmund later, the German guy, it just did not work at all. Why did they try to do that? Why didn't they use any English-speaking guy there? It was not uncomfortable, but...
Oh, that's right, yes. Let's talk about the shows in London before we go to Dortmund. There's one more thing I wanted to mention about the 27th. The gong. I have to mention the gong during Waiting for the Worms because it is so weird. The presence of the gong from Live at Pompeii, repainted with a hammer's emblem on it. Why Roger thought it was a good idea to put something that is openly on fire on that stage, right next to the wall, 4 feet from Andy Bone, who has to stand like a robot the whole time and play without even flinching. Roger's afraid of it. If you watch that Nassau video, Roger, he lights the gong. He's doing the whole, and the final solution is he's doing the whole Waiting for the Worms thing underneath. And when he starts hitting it, he recoils back. He hits it and he takes a step back. He's afraid of this thing. Why would you do that to yourself? You're lighting this live flame on stage and slamming into this gong. Very careful with that axe, Eugene, or salsaphone, or set the controls in that way. It
Right? Kind of
harkens back to that.
setting his own history on fire, maybe in some degree. Who knows? Sort of like literally painting over what the band used to be.
Yeah, I mean, you definitely could make that argument, but it's just, why would he do that to him? And it's only for that one show. There is no other wall show where they bring this gong out on stage and light it on fire. Who approved of this? Who thought it was a good idea after they were barred from doing pyrotechnics in LA after the first night's near disaster?
Well, it's like what Snowy White, I think it was, said. He said, I think it was Snowy, said he could not believe that on the last show of one of Roger's tours, he was still tinkering with the backup singer's parts. He is just such a tinkerer. He just wants to say, well, maybe we tried it like this, or maybe if we tried it like that. I mean, and so I guess that way, sometimes you get little refinements that come off really, really well, and other times you get really bad ideas that are trotted out for one show, and then immediately, get the gong, so to speak, and are trotted right back off stage. Yeah,
and that's the thing when Nils, and we are transitioning to August, I promise. But when we talk about the staging of things and the band is only playing behind the wall, well, here during In the Flesh 2 and Run Like Hell, they're out there on the front of the stage, they're playing, and there's the Waiting for the Worms animations are coming after, and the surrogates do a fantastic job of acting like robots when they're on stage during that last quarter of the show. Andy Bone, his silhouette being projected behind the wall as he's wearing Roger's 1 t-shirt. I wonder why Roger decided to wear a t-shirt with a big 1 on it. Who could have possibly wondered why he would do that? But when you watch them on that stage, all the surrogates, they're like robots. They're very still. They're very limited in their playing. And that even goes for Willie Wilson, the drummer. How you can't be flexible as a drummer is such a weird idea to me, but he pulls it off really, really well. All of them do. And they play along with this idea that they are the faceless Pink Floyd with the band on stage. And Roger, in the manuscript, I believe, writes that the surrogate band is this idea of being beside oneself, which is interesting because I wonder if that's how he felt sometime in the past, in 1977, whether during Cleveland, where he had to be injected with something to get rid of a stomach virus.
Philadelphia, by the way. Philadelphia.
Oh, Philadelphia.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. I had a friend who was at that show, so it's burned in.
Oh, that's excellent. Interesting. But of course, when we get to the end and we get to the trial, the way the trial is engineered is so clever because it's playing, and also Waiting for the Worms is so clever because when the marching hammers are in unison, it's this perfect illusion, like it's one big widescreen image. Roger attributes it to being like the film Napoleon, which utilized 3 separate projectors to create one cohesive image. And watching that illusion and with the pounding of the drums and the hammer chant, it is scary, and it creates this anxiety as you watch the editing get more and more intense and flashy. And there's little Pink on top of the wall during stop, and a poor roadie's lying on his back 30 feet above the stage, puppeteering this little figure to try and do, convey whatever it is to convey with that. And when the trial happens and you have characters jumping from projector to projector and images taking up the width, it's magic. It's just movie magic at its finest. And when the wall finally comes down with this cacophonous, immense sound that in the quad, they used to crank up the levels on the subwoofers louder and louder as the wall would start to come down to the point where the whole arena would shake. It would be 115 decibels of sound coming straight through that PA, and it could take it. The microphones on the recordings can't, but the PA certainly could take it. But when we make our way to London in August, Gary Udman is still our master of ceremonies. He takes over that duty still, and Howard Lambden takes a multi-camera film crew to shoot the shows from August 6th to August 9th, and that resulted in a video that is known as Divided We Fall by Harvested. It is probably the best looking version of that's out there, other than a few doctored versions that fans have attempted that are not going to look as good until eventually somebody coughs up a lower generation source, which, given the nature of this tour and the videos surrounding it, I don't know if that'll happen anytime soon.
I remember somebody asking, I don't remember who it was, asking, so where did this come from exactly? And I remember thinking to myself, That's not a good idea to ask that question.
Don't ask the questions you don't want to know the answers to.
Well, and also, the answer could hurt somebody. I mean, somebody could lose their job or get sued. So yeah, it's interesting that, I think, and I'm not 100% sure, but I believe my very first wall show that I had on tape, and literally cassette tape, was the very first wall show, was February 7th, 1980. And I think my second one, I'm not 100% sure, was this edited video from those two Earl's Court shows in 1980. And it's an interesting performance. I think one thing I would just want to say just more generally is, at this point in the touring history of the Wall, it's pretty much settled down. Right? In other words, there's a lot more growing pains in February, and by the time we get to August, it's like, okay, this is in place. And so for me as a listener, I think I'm now in a position to be able to say something a little bit controversial, which is that for the most part, I actually don't like the changes that they've made between the studio version and the live version. I think, and that's my own personal feeling, but most of the changes, the extra verse in The Show Must Go On, the dumping of the studio version of Empty Spaces, and a couple other things I could name, it's interesting how consistently actually I prefer the studio version. I will say the live version of Outside the Wall, and also the soundtrack version for that matter, that I find more moving than the version on the studio album. And there are a couple other things where I think the live version is particularly effective. But I think one thing I realized as I settle into this is, much as I love the experience of being able to see the concert, and again, I can only emphasize, like, we're really only getting a subset of what people heard on the day. A soundboard feed cannot do justice to the three-dimensionality of it, to the impact, to the audience reactions, things like that. It's just not the same. But it really does bring home, like, wow, like this is great, this is fun, I like it. But compositionally, I liked it better the way they did it on the studio album, for the most part. I mean, again, last few bricks, that's good fun. And one acknowledges that they had to make changes in order to adapt for the live format. It's not as if I'm trying to play Monday morning quarterback. But I do find that, you begin to notice, and it's actually a theme that you see really recurringly with the Floyd, is that they tend to make little tweaks, whether it's small things like the fact that Richard Wright, for some reason, always sang Lying Supine in the Sunshine. Don't know that anybody's ever explained why he did that on time, but he did. And other things involving, like the rearrangement of the Animals album for 1977, all necessary, all successful in varying degrees. But as I re-listened to these shows, it was sort of reminded me, and I found myself reaffirming, you know what? The studio version does hit a little harder for me as an experience, purely compositionally. Now, obviously, I'm not going to go to an amphitheater and have somebody hit play on a cassette so we can all, 5,000 of us can, or 10,000, however many fit into Earl's Court, could all listen to that together. I think I'd rather have seen the Floyd play live. But so that's what it begins to hit me. It's like, okay, this is settled in, and actually there was something fun about all the weirdness that happened while it was settling in. And now that it's starting to really settle in, maybe it's a little less fun, paradoxically enough.
So then they moved to Germany in 1981, February. And I have no idea why they did that.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Do you know why they picked Dortmund?
I think the reason why is simply that the Floyd were given the offer to do the shows in Germany. And at that point, they why not? Why not go to Dortmund to do these shows? They had all the equipment in London. All they had to do was, ship it up a little bit, and there it is. I'm sure Vernon Fitch wrote more eloquently than I could have stated why, but these shows happened, and that, they had the equipment, they were offered, and up they went.
I mean, it's interesting. I didn't know. Of course, Nils, you know where Dortmund is, but I didn't, and I didn't know that it was also it's close to the border with the Netherlands and with Belgium too. I wonder if that played an influence too. It's sort of like trying to serve, several. I mean, the Belgians and particularly the Dutch were always so good to the Floyd that maybe it was their small way of trying to serve them. I don't know, as opposed to doing something that would have been much further out of the way.
Oh, I have to admit, for us in Germany, Dortmund is not really close to the border. I mean,
right.
Everything is close to the border from American standard, I would say. But it's a center of Western Germany. Yes, that's true. So it is okay to go from Hamburg, Munich, Netherlands, Belgium. That's okay. I understand it. But I have to say, it's a Western Germany city in the Ruhrgebiet. That's the area called. It's a coal mining, or it was a coal mining area, a very rough and ugly area. And to be honest, Dortmund in 1981 was a very ugly city. And it still is. Oh God, every Dortmunder will hate me now, but it is still quite ugly. So it must have been really, really tough for them to stay there for a week. And as we know, and Kyle will tell us a little bit about it, I guess, later on in the pros and cons of hitchhiking, Roger even refers to Germany again, and I think even to Dortmund, because it must have been horrifying for them being there for a week, as I said. And also you can hear from the first show in Dortmund to the last show that they even got more sarcastic, maybe even more angry about everything, or tired, or whatever.
And this leads me to what we talked about. I think Nils and we talked about this a little bit in the episode on pros and cons of hitchhiking. Roger most certainly derived his experience from Dortmund in the song Arabs with Knives in West German Skies. And I even went further to look into the geographics of what Roger mentions. He mentions Krupp Steelworks. Krupp Steelworks is, I think, only an hour or 2 hours away from Dortmund. And the idea of having this boisterous MC saying, "Good evening, sirs and madams," who does that at the beginning of every Dortmund show? Willie Thumbstick. Fritz is just a bloated, overdone parody of Willie Thumbstick, the MC at Dortmund. And this, very festive sort of environment that Roger somehow connects to the whole thing. And it's why, and I could be convinced, of course, that Roger, it derives from some other experience, but given the proximity of the creation of pros and cons to, well, maybe not the creation, but the recording of pros and cons to these shows in Dortmund, there has to be a connection there. You don't just spend a week in a city like Dortmund and come out the other end with some kind of sarcastic, biting view of it. And it's to the point where the final show in the Dortmund run, February 20th, before In the Flesh 2, Willie Thumbstick's doing his normal routine as the second MC, and Roger starts railing at him on stage. "Thank you very much indeed. We'll see you again sometime, maybe." And Willie goes, "Go fuck yourself." And Roger does a count in the Flesh, and the story goes that Roger steps up to Willie and pies him in the face right as In the Flesh 2 starts. And whether or not it was a prank or some kind of parting gift, we don't really know. And there's a couple of photos from February 20th looking down on the stage where, during Outside the Wall, the band are all wearing little party hats, and there's remnants of a pie sitting on the corner of the stage. So Roger must have had a field day with this idea of planning out this revenge of having to be stuck in this ugly German city for a week by doing that to poor Willie Thumbstick. And Willie has gone on record in later years saying he hated the whole thing. He hated the whole rock and roll and the audience and everything. And even in Germany, the Germans don't like Willie Thumbstick coming on stage and interrupting their rock show. They start booing and hissing at him. And Gary Yudman in London and in New York was getting a lot of heat as well. There are people who are shouting obscenities at him and booing at him. And of course, we'll get there. But in June, Gary takes the biggest fall for the entire band, and it's one of my favorite bits of those shows.
I mean, and here we are, kind of roasting Dortmund, and yet Pink Floyd started their 1977 tour in the exact same spot, right? In other words,
that's right. That's Hall.
So there's got to be something going on there. I mean, this is a band who were incredibly frustrated in 1977 that instead of playing Earl's Court, which is where I believe they wanted to play, they were stuck at Empire Pool Wembley again, right? They did not want to be there, but they did those 5 shows there because that's what they could get. And so, by 1981, they would have had their pick. And so there must have been something that was pulling them in there. I can only wonder what, but I can't imagine them, particularly given, I think they hadn't even originally been planning any 81 shows, had they? It was sort of like they were just going to do the 3 residencies in 80.
Yeah, and that was it. And of course, because it was so expensive to put on anyway, every band member lost some $15,000 every time they performed one of the shows, except Rick Wright, because he was a payroll member of the band, so he made the money at the end of the day.
Did you catch the story about how, for all the reports of Rick Wright being an absentee participant during the Wall, there was that one recording session for Bring the Boys Back Home where he was the only one who showed up?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes. There's an irony to
interesting.
that. There's an
Yeah,
irony to
exactly.
that. And I
All
love it.
those snare drum players, I think it was, playing in the middle
Mhm.
of wherever. Was it New York? I don't remember. And
Oh yeah. If it
yeah,
was if it was Ezra in charge of that, it would have been in New York.
yeah. So,
But we talk ill of Dortmund itself, but the shows are infallible. They get really, really good by even the early, like even the first couple of dates into the end of the leg. February 18th, 1981 has my favorite Young Lust the band ever performed because Roger, in his lovely aggravated way, he starts off with, "This is something you could shake your ass to. It's called a Young Lust." And I don't know what happens between that and the song starting and the solos and everything. The entire band just gets into it, and it is the closest thing to hard rock Pink Floyd ever became.
hmm.
It's spectacular. And the timing of the sound effect of the phone call at the end is so perfect that the moment the band stops, you hear the receiver being picked up. That timing is just cosmically
Huh.
wonderful. And it's one of those things where they didn't do that very often. The timing of that was never all that perfect, but the few times it is, it shines for me. That little thing that goes just right timing
So
wise.
isn't that the same show where he, before Run Like Hell, said something like, "This is for all the whistlers in the audience"? It was so funny.
I think so. It's February 18th. It's the same show where he talks about that. Roger had a lovely time with those Run Like Hell speeches, and they're so funny to listen to. Every one of them is, and of course, that's how we identify these shows usually, is every one of them is a slightly unique variation on, "Do you like our pig?" And the audience cheers. And, he's an old pig, but he's a big pig. And he goes on this whole thing, "Fuck off, piggy, go home, you fat, bloated, overrun," and he goes on this whole thing, and David's trying to start the song, and he keeps going. It's in June, I think, June of 81, the June 16th, where he makes fun of the whistlers by trying to whistle like them. Oh, that
Yeah.
must be so fun.
Ha.
He's just going at it with them. And that's where Roger Waters is at his best, is when he's completely having a run with the audience for their ability to cheer at a rock concert, which is totally normal, but I guess not to Roger.
One thing is, and this is something I've been thinking about a lot lately. I remember reading an article, I think it was, complaining about long drum solos in rock. And the article somehow managed to miss one of the main reasons that people have these long drum solos or whatever. It's to give everybody in the band a chance to go to the bathroom, to, sometimes to drink or use drugs, but a lot of the time just to take a break, go to the bathroom. So I wonder, on any given occasion, we hear Roger temporizing and sort of going along a little longer, ranting. It's interesting to speculate how much of that is him just abandoning himself to the moment as a performer, and how much is actually of it as a tactic to cover up for the fact that he noticed that David Gilmour is having a little bit of trouble with this piece of equipment and needs an extra moment. Is he getting little messages in the cans? Something that happens on the 20th in Dortmund, which is kind of fun, is during the last few bricks, there's this very strange feedback that happens right at the end of it, and they sort of, it's like this kind of almost, I can't tell whether it's a synthesizer note that's self-oscillating or what it is, but somehow they bend it in tune, but then it just goes on and on and on and on and on, right? And it's so the ending of that, where you would normally get the transition to Goodbye Cruel World, it doesn't feel, of course we don't have a video of this, but it doesn't feel like they're waiting for the wall builders. It feels to me like essentially they want to try to figure out where on earth that noise is coming from, which in all fairness to Roger and any other perfectionists out there, that should be a 5-second job for a really good live sound engineer. Like if you hear a sound you're not supposed to hear, you just hit the mute button. But for whatever reason, it takes them about a minute to sort it out. And we know that it's an aberration because right afterwards you hear Roger go 1, 2, 1, 2. So something has clearly gone wrong, but it's just so striking that a moment like that, which would have been connotative of some kind of minor musical disaster at most previous shows, instead kind of manages to pass unnoticed. I mean, again, it's the thing that people like David Gilmour are so good at doing, where, if you're a musician with any kind of intuitive, spontaneous qualities to your musicianship, you just find stuff to do when you need to kill time, right? And similarly with Roger, if you're an MC or a frontman with any kind of intuitive spontaneity to you, you just find funny stuff to say so that you don't draw attention to the fact that one of your colleagues is needing to fix this or find that or put on a fresh string or whatever it is. But it's just, I think by this point, you can imagine that part of, and there's probably documentary evidence to this effect, there have to have been conversations, people saying, oh my God, why can't we keep this going? Like, this is great. We finally got it down. Let's tour this for another 2 more years. Of course, they had a movie to make, and that was probably part of why they didn't. But we know, of course, that they got all these offers to put on the show in places that would have run directly contrary to Waters' stated ambition of having a smaller audience.
The band even considered having Andy Bone sing Roger's parts at JFK Stadium, and they backed out from the idea because Roger balks at the idea of doing it in a stadium. And Roger's gone on record saying they didn't have the balls to do it. Well, I think it's that they did. They just didn't want Roger doing anything brash should they make that decision.
Right. Well, we're talking about somebody who was threatening to leave Pink Floyd since 1970. Right. I mean,
that's very fair.
Yeah, Ron Geeson has confirmed that as far back as that, and I think it was it Steve O'Rourke, somebody close to the band, said that maybe it was Storm Thorgerson, said that all members of the band came to him at one point or another and said they were thinking about leaving. So it's like, no, I mean, it's the most dysfunctional marriage ever. So, all right. So then we get to this last bank of shows, right? And again, this sort of very bittersweet moment, knowing that with the exception of Live 8, this is the last time they'd all be together on stage.
And most of these shows were mostly put on for the sole purpose of filming portions to be intertwined with the Wall film that was going to be worked on. And they shot it on 35 or 70 millimeter film. There's been a debate whether or not it's one or the other. But this footage, along with the footage from 1980, has never surfaced in any official capacity except for the Behind the Wall documentary, as well as a minute and a half of just the happiest days of our lives. And seeing even just a snippet of happiest days of our lives, it is so bizarre to see the Wall from all these different angles in a widescreen format. One day I hope to see it. One day, maybe, as long as things go to the trend of maybe Roger has decided to give up the rights to the movie to Sony, which we can kind of hope, because Gilmour has gone on record saying if he had control over it, he would have released it years and years and years ago. And Roger has gone on many occasions saying that he has stamped out any effort to put a video out because it does not do justice to what is a very theatrical event, which to some degree is true. But at some point, you gotta give us a little bit, Roger. Give us a little bit. The live album's good, but it's a pastiche of every single Earl's Court show in 1980 and 1981 in an almost unfathomably cut together way. I think it's worse than the overdubs they did on Amagama, because you'll have Roger singing a line of Comfortably Numb that one date is 3 words, and then another date is the next 4 words. And then there's a splice between. It is nuts how much they spliced that album together.
Oddly enough, that doesn't bother me. I think, the thing that really sticks in my craw is what they did to Wembley 1974, where they overdubbed like backing vocals that were never ever present at the concert. I can sort of see why, Roger, and I mean, I say this as somebody who recorded an album of classical music, right? Or recorded it with some excellent musicians, but for a variety of reasons, it was necessary to piece together the performances from a variety of takes. So I can sort of see why Roger, who in a weird way thinks of his music in certain parameters like classical music, would want to put out a perfected, Wall. But yeah, I mean, if only we believed that Alan Parker had it. I went to school actually with Alan Parker's son. We went to the same college. Didn't know him well, but if they were resident, in other words, with anybody but Roger Waters, I'd say maybe there was a chance that, someday. But as you say, I think unless Sony somehow manages to engage in just the right gentle legal arm twisting, I mean, what we would really want is every concert presented, warts and all, as it was.
As unedited as possible.
Yeah.
Which you almost could, because Roger, he'd gone on record when he was doing his Wall tour that the film crew shot a lot more than he thought they did, meaning that they shot more than likely enough to construct like a complete show from all the vantage points that they had. They had some 8 cameras running at the same time on some songs. But of course, coming to the actual shows themselves, the June 81 leg is pretty great on the whole, but it's because they have been ironing all the kinks out of this piece for some year and a half before that, except for the most glaring mechanical failure to happen in these entire shows. I think it's June 14th, 1981. Let me refer to
which has some other issues too. I have in my notes that Roger just completely has a mental lapse or something, and he botches In the Flesh quite badly. So
Yeah, there we go. It's June 14th, 1981, where at some point between The Show Must Go On and Gary Udman coming on stage, the lifts that were required to bring the band's instruments from beneath the stage during that fourth quarter of the show, they stop working and they're halfway raised. And Gary Udman, who he isn't doing his normal, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Earl's Court, and he's talking very fast, he's doing his whole thing. He's doing the long-winded zombie impression of himself. And he does this for 13 minutes straight while the band is trying to figure out what's going on mechanically. And Gilmour can't reach his pedals. And, he has to step around this gap in the floor to get to his equipment. And Yudman, bless his heart, really does it the whole 13 minutes. I don't know. And he does this thing that I call the Yudman turn, where he'll go, well, I think the band's about ready to go. And he'll slowly turn himself away. No, not quite yet. And he does this, and the audience is just wanting to strangle the man because they just comfortably numb finishes. The show must go on happens. Okay, what's the next part of the show? This guy talking for 13 minutes.
It feels so much more, let's use the word mutual than with Cynthia Fox, right? It's like for some reason, they want to kill him, and yet he and they are in on the joke. It somehow it just feels much less demeaning, I guess would be the word,
right?
Because he's basically doing an Andy Kaufman routine, right? He's putting himself out there to take everybody's slings and arrows.
And of course, right before Run Like Hell starts, when the band finally goes through In the Flesh, and then at the start of Run Like Hell, Roger says, we are not the type of group to apologize for this sort of thing, which is ironic because given literally at that first LA show, he apologizes for them having to put out the fire. So here's this Roger in this, leather trench coat on stage playing himself in this vicarious way, acting as if, well, we don't apologize for these type of delays and things like that. And it's so very much him to do that. But of course, with these shows, June 16th and June 17th, 1981 are the perfect Wall shows. There are almost no technical errors. There are almost no lyrical errors. June 16th is as close to a perfect Wall show as they come. Comfortably Numb is fantastic. The whole band is firing on all cylinders. They got it right. And they got it right for those last two dates. But of course, there is something oddly melancholic about June 17th, 81, knowing that this is the last time the four-man Floyd would play together until Live 8. And when they perform Outside the Wall, there's this irony, all alone or in twos, the ones who really love you walk up, and, just that whole sentiment of it with this little, just this little ragtag band getting together and singing this nice little song. And as the Floyd exit stage left, to quote Snagglepuss, they exit stage left, and that's it. That's the end of Pink Floyd as we knew it from 1968 to 1981.
And they knew it too. I mean, that's the thing, is that yes, of course they came out with the movie, they came out with Final Cut, and ultimately Gilmour decided to keep going. But I think everybody saw the writing on the wall, pun absolutely not intended, that they just didn't really want to be doing this anymore. And Waters in particular, I mean, he was just aware that, I guess this is a funny thing to say, particularly given my own tastes, but to do what he wanted to do, he didn't really need them anymore. And Contrary-wise, all of them wanted to do things other than march to Roger Waters' orders. He gave David Gilmour obviously more leeway. He understood, what a champion for his own ideas he had in Gilmour. And I think he never, I don't think, crossed the line into treating him like nothing more than a hired hand from, they've been abusive to each other in all kinds of other ways, but not that particular one. But I think, ultimately everybody just, again, I go back to that story that Andy Jackson said of just not wanting to be in that room anymore, and you can respect somebody and admire their work ethic, admire their creativity, and just not want to be in that room anymore. And I think that's the point they reached. So yeah, it is quite melancholic. But I should, by the way, mention there is for those who are really into the footage, there is a rehearsal tape of, wasn't it finally dated to before these June?
Yes, it's dated to June of 81. And the reason why it was recorded by a gentleman named Mal Himes, and he had a residency at Earl's Court, and he was able to sneak in what he called a steam-powered VHS camera to shoot them rehearsing. And what's really interesting is it was originally coined as 1980, And back when I used to be very into the wall, again, some of you may have known me in a past life that I did that, there's a moment where during Goodbye Blue Sky, you could see these projections on the circular screen, and those were only added during Dortmund, and they were present in June, and it's early concept art for what would become the animated sequence in the film. And that's how we were able to pinpoint that, among a few other things, just the technical way that things go. And you talk about recycling different parts of the animal, again, going back to that sentiment. Bring the Boys Back Home, these weird flashing images that are in front of the wall during that song, they're all derived from old concepts that Gerald Scarfe had finished for Wish You Were Here and for Animals that never saw the light of day outside of that. And it has haunted me for years that we don't know where half these pieces come from. There's like a test reel for one of the songs from Animals, I think it's Dogs, that Roger shot down because he was too wounded about his marriage at the time, so it never came to be as an animated sequence. But it's this dark thing with this pig being eaten by skeleton creatures and all sorts of grotesque stuff, and you see it in these flashes during Bring the Boys Back Home, and you see it most clearly, I think, in Malheim's rehearsal video. And it's so bizarre to see those images and still wonder where they all went, where they all came from. I think it would take years to figure out where all this stuff went. You'd have to write multiple books, as Scarfe has, and he still hasn't covered it all.
And isn't it interesting? I mean, we have this tape because Malheim did that band a favor, essentially. He let them in early. He had the time reserved. That's how I understand it. But isn't it interesting what we have to turn to in order to differentiate between years? I mean, in other words, if you play me a 1972 show and you play me just Set the Controls for the Heart of the Sun, I've got a pretty good chance of telling you it's from 1972. Like, I can just listen to the music alone and be able to say, yep, based on cues, or Careful with That Axe Eugene from 1968, or whatever. Like, with some consistency, you can just listen to the music alone and peg exactly what era a performance is from. And isn't it interesting that we have to use other cues to pin down, a wall rehearsal, because it's a sign of the progress that Waters has made toward what is, from a business perspective, an excellent idea. The ultimate, consistent, reproducible, night to night, it's the same experience where you've got complete control, and you don't have to worry that your band leader of 1967 is going to, let's say, have an off night and give the audience something it won't tolerate. Instead, it's the exact opposite extreme. It's basically, like going from the Pink Floyd said what they played in 67 was a crude form of jazz. Well, what they're playing in 1981, maybe arguably it's really a Broadway musical. Well, let's instead call it, a very technologically sophisticated form of classical music, where the idea is it really should all come off the same way night after night. And if it doesn't, then that's viewed as more of a failure than an opportunity, let's say.
Okay, so after listening to all of that, all the insight and everything, I don't know how it's for you, but I want to pick up every single recording I have from the wall and watch every single video. That was really exciting, and thank you very much, Kyle and Phil. It was really, really great. Many insights and really a nice chat. And thank you all for listening to this episode of the podcast. And please do not forget to subscribe to the Fingles podcast not to miss any upcoming episodes. So thank you once again. Thank you, Phil. Thank you, Kyle. Bye-bye.
Our pleasure. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Good night.
Thanks a lot.